Ukraine's top military commander says 30,000 Russian troops have been pulled from the battlefield in the south to defend against Ukraine's incursion into Russia. He made the comments yesterday while claiming his forces have captured 100 Russian settlements since this counter-offensive began. However, he warned that Moscow is building up its own forces in Ukraine's east, where Russian troops are advancing. All of this comes as Moscow continues to shell cities throughout Ukraine. President Zelensky revealed this week that F-16s were used to shoot down Russian missiles on Monday as multiple regions were targeted. Pretty complicated situation at the moment in Ukraine. Not sure where the balance of power lies on that front.
Yeah, such a bold offensive by the Ukrainian forces, but now we see what will happen next. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Israel forces today carried out large-scale raids in the West Bank. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, 9 people have been killed there. Israel's foreign minister posted overnight on social media that Israeli forces are working to, quote, thwart Islamic Iranian terrorist infrastructures. Joining us now, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is the Chief International Analyst for NBC News. Admiral, so good to see you this morning. Let's start with the Middle East. What is your read on what Israel is trying to do in the West Bank?
Yeah, let's level set for a minute. We tend to talk a lot about Hezbollah to the north, Hamas in Gaza Strip, and the Houthis on the Red Sea. Those are 3 distinct fronts for the Israelis. Here we're seeing them in the West Bank, which has been relatively quiet, but an operation where they kill 10 Palestinians, say, population adjusted, that would be like the feds going into New Mexico and killing 350 terrorists. So this is a significant operation by the standards, and it shows you that Israel is fighting a war on multiple fronts.
But what is the risk, though, that it could inflame the situation further? I mean, this is West Bank different than Gaza. Also, of course, negotiators are in Cairo as we speak, trying to hammer out this deal for a ceasefire deal that would lead to the release of more hostages. We know one had been rescued just in the last day or so. They're not at the finish line yet for these negotiations, and it seems like every time they get close, there's more violence that delivers potentially a setback.
Exactly right, and that's the real concern, is the longer-term ability to deliver a ceasefire. I think that everything that is happening in the West Bank is going to have a chilling effect, shall we say, on all that. And it happens as a backdrop of Iran kind of lurking back there, preparing perhaps to retaliate for the assassination of the leader of Hamas carried out in Tehran a few weeks ago. So this situation is in flux, to say the least. The Israeli move into the West Bank shows you they believe Iran is fomenting unrest there. And again, it shows you the challenges of Israel facing multiple threats on multiple axes.
And Mike Barnicle, we know the Biden administration has been desperately pushing to get this deal done, but the highest ranking members of the government have some real skepticism whether the parties involved want to reach an agreement.
Yeah, well, that's one of the key obstacles, it seems, to any ceasefire agreement. But, Admiral, this morning, as we're talking right now, there are 2 carrier strike force groups in the Mediterranean. There are a total of 18 warships in the Mediterranean. There's submarines in the Mediterranean. There's enough Tomahawk missiles to level half of the Middle East. You have an Israeli government fighting in the West Bank. Gaza is basically an open furnace, destroyed from stem to stern. The Israeli government, parts of its cabinet, seem to be actively opposing any move for a ceasefire or a peace agreement and a recognition of a Palestinian state. So my question to you, with all of this on the table, is if indeed there were a peace agreement and an agreement to establish a Palestinian state, given the disruption, West Bank, Gaza, what would the geography of such a Palestinian state look like?
Wonderful question. I think the conventional answer would be it would include both the West Bank, where Israel is, as we talked about a moment ago, conducting counter-terrorist operations really directed against Iranian influence there. So West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And of course, you're absolutely correct. By the way, like the nautical metaphor, Gaza destroyed from stem to stern, it really is. It's going to have to be rebuilt. The good news is that is not a requirement to boil the ocean to do that. It's a relatively small space, 2 million people, significant, but could you rebuild it with Saudi money, U.S. support, other Arab states, UAE pitching in? I think you could, Mike. So that's kind of the outline of what this would look like. The challenge is not the geography. The challenge is the governance. And here, Israel, I think correctly, is adamant that Hamas will not have a role in that going forward. That's going to require the Palestinian Authority up in the West Bank to really step up. You're going to need a new generation of leadership there. Hey, final thought. You mentioned those carrier strike groups. I commanded one of them, as you know, USS Enterprise. Alongside them, by the way, are U.S. Marines who are embarked in big naval vessels, so-called large deck amphibs. Those Marines are there to not conduct ground combat operations, but for evacuations of Americans if necessary. So yes, there's a lot of American firepower there. It's designed to send a signal to Iran not to get involved in this at this, as you point out correctly, Mike, very difficult moment.
So before we turn to the latest out of Ukraine, we want to show you the moment one of the few captives was brought home alive from Gaza almost 11 months after the Hamas terror attack in Israel. NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley has more on that incredible rescue.
Freedom for a hostage held captive in Gaza. After 326 days in captivity, hostage Qa'ed Farhan al-Qadi was rescued by Israeli commandos and safely returned home. A rare moment of celebration. Al-Qadi is only the 8th hostage who's been rescued alive in a military operation. Dozens more are thought to remain in captivity. Al-Qadi rescued in what the IDF is calling a complex operation by special forces in southern Gaza, from inside Hamas's vast tunnel network, where soldiers say they found him alone. The 52-year-old father of 11 had been working in security at a kibbutz in southern Israel when he was captured on October 7th. Al-Qadi is an Arab Bedouin, a mostly Muslim minority in Israel. At least 17 of them were killed during Hamas's terror attack in October. His family overwhelmed with joy and relief. We prayed for him, his brother says. My mother prayed for him more. Her prayer reached the sky. Those still in captivity hoping for Al-Qadi's kind of liberation.
Extraordinary scenes there and some really, really good news. Admiral, let's turn now to Ukraine and get your analysis as to what we're seeing here. This Ukraine offensive into Russia certainly caught Putin by surprise. It's been pretty humiliating, to say the least, and they're still pounding away at targets in Russia. That said, some concern has arisen that perhaps is leaving Ukraine vulnerable now for some sort of counterstrike from Russia. What's your take?
This is a very bold move on the part of the Ukrainians. You kind of have to think back to the Korean War and Douglas MacArthur reaching around the North Korean ranks to take the beachhead at Incheon and get behind them. Really bold military move. That's the good news. The bad news is when you create that kind of military salient, think a peninsula inserted in the side of Russia. The bad news is it can be surrounded, it can be cut off. Putin is probably moving significant forces there right now to contend with this. He's also, as you mentioned, Jonathan, launching massive strikes against the Ukrainian electric grid and their infrastructure, continuing the war crimes for which he is famous. So this one is poised right on a knife edge. Caddy asked earlier, what's the balance? And I think that's the right question to be asking. In my view, at the moment, Russia is still going to continue to grind away. Russian military strategy is kind of 3 yards in a cloud of dust, to go back to Coach Woody Hayes. But the Ukrainians are going to continue to show creativity, innovation, bold military thinking. This is an example of it. I think the forces are poised on a knife edge on that battlefront.
All right, we will be watching all of the latest developments. Retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral, thank you as always.